Howdy, y'all. My husband is here with me from San Antonio, and he told me to say that to get some laughs, and he was right. So credit to him. Thanks, Jordan. I am so excited to be here with you all. Thank you, Mary, for introducing me. If at any point you can't hear me, I'm a very animated speaker. Just like wave at me, and I'll recenter myself. But I I'm overjoyed to be on this island. Yes, it was a Herculean effort to get here, but it was totally worth it. I'm so glad that I got to take every single mode of transportation in the past few days. Love it. But I'm so excited to be here to talk about my absolute favorite topic in the entire universe, which is reuse at all scales. But before I get started, I want to do a little visualization exercise with y'all. Surprise! So I invite you, if you're able, to close your eyes for a moment. And I want you to picture a building that has great importance to you. Something that's really, really special, has played a pivotal moment in your life. Maybe it's this building, or a building that you grew up going to often. Maybe it's your childhood home. Maybe it's even your middle school, because I know everyone peaked in middle school, right? And I want you to enter into that space and think about what you see. The textures, the colors, the materials, the lighting, the fixtures, all of those different dimensions that created that space that makes it valuable and special to you. And now I want you to walk outside, position yourself maybe on a hill overlooking that building, and I want you to picture it being demolished. There's heavy machinery, wrecking balls, bulldozers, breaking it down bit by bit, sending it to a landfill. Now open your eyes. How's everyone feeling? Shout it out. What are the feelings you're feeling? Sad, angry, grief. All right, that's the end of my presentation. Thanks, y'all. I'm just kidding. Okay. So now that we're all feeling sad together, which is exactly why you guys came here, I want you to close your eyes once more. And I want you to be overlooking that building before the wrecking balls do their damage, right before that moment. And all of a sudden, all of that heavy machinery disappears. Poof, poof, poof. Now, I do have some bad news. That building does need to come down, but instead of those heavy machines tearing it bit by bit, you see people converge on that site. And they're taking great care to take down that building board by board, from the roof to the foundation. They're salvaging those materials, redirecting them to a new purpose. Maybe the flooring is repairing your neighbor's home. Maybe the fixtures are going to a new facility down the street, a restaurant. But what's important is that all of those materials that held that space are being reused. Now open your eyes again. Does that quell the loss just a little bit, knowing that that special space is giving new life to other buildings? Great, okay, awesome. So I love doing that visualization exercise just because it reinforces the fact that buildings are so much more than just static, inanimate objects. They hold space for us to live, to play, to learn, to love. And the materials that we use to construct them hold value. Not only that embodied cultural, emotional value, monetary value, environmental value. So this is ultimately why I'm here, is to talk a little bit about how the city of San Antonio decided that demolition for all of our buildings in the city just shouldn't be an option. So we are very, very happy to share that way back in September of last year, we adopted the nation's largest deconstruction ordinance. And you don't have to read all of these details, but essentially what it says is that the city's oldest housing stock, if it is approved for removal, if it can't be saved, because not everything can be saved, it's going to be deconstructed instead of demolished. So for over 9 months, we've been seeing that play out in the 7th largest city in the country. And you see a crew like that taking apart a house instead of wrecking balls. So we're very, very happy that we got that over the finish line. But how did we get here? You heard Mary at the beginning talk about how I work for an office of historic preservation. And of course, our #1 goal is to keep buildings standing, right? That is our paramount goal. That is what we're trained in. That's what we want to do. but there are going to be those inevitable losses for whatever reason. And on the screen here today is a picture of a Facebook post from Shannon Shea Miller, who is the director of our office over 6 years ago. And the city of Portland, Oregon was the first US city to adopt a deconstruction ordinance. And right after that was passed in 2016, Shannon said, "This is on my list for San Antonio. Let's do it in 2017. It makes sense for so many reasons." Spoiler alert, we did not do it in 2017. It took us several more years to get that across the finish line. But I always like sharing this post because it shows that little seed of vision, right? And almost that little seed of anger, of grief, of sadness, saying, I don't want it to happen like this anymore, right? I don't want to see wrecking balls tearing apart our buildings in the way that I've seen it growing up. Let's think about doing it just a little bit differently. And this is why. This doesn't serve really anyone except for the landfill. And how dare the landfill have the audacity to think that it deserves these materials, right? So these are all pictures that we took in San Antonio over the course of developing our ordinance. And we always found it important to share to our elected officials, to our stakeholders, to our community, to say this doesn't have to be the only way this happens, even though we're used to growing up with it. And I have to give such a big credit to our community in San Antonio, the residents of our dense, older historic districts, and even those that weren't designated historic, coming up to us and saying, we don't want to see this anymore, right? Let's do it a little differently. And what's really, really interesting for the preservationists in the audience, sometimes we look at preservation as this binary field, right? If you save a building, that's a victory. If you lose the building, you've lost. And it's black and white, right? But what we've opened ourselves up to in San Antonio from a municipal policy perspective is kind of this interstitial gray area where we can serve as advocates, as leaders, as policymakers, partnership makers, stewarding our community in new and creative ways, especially in the face of threats that may threaten our built heritage. Now, in San Antonio, our climate threats look a lot different than the climate threats in Nantucket. I think the heat index in San Antonio this week is 120 degrees. So I'm so glad I'm here today. Did I mention that? That's another reason. So extreme weather, heat is very, very real in San Antonio. And that just reinforces the fact that we still need to steward our built heritage, even if the structure no longer can be standing. So we're kind of exploring this new frontier, if you will, in this little bubble of what preservation can and should be in the 21st century. And for those of you that may practice historic preservation or steward an older house here in Nantucket, thank you for being stewards. This is straight from the federal government. If a historic feature or material is deteriorated beyond repair or missing, it should be replaced in kind. And in kind means we should use a similar material to replace that structure. And what is more in kind than construction materials from the same era that a building was built, right? If you do have to take down a 1700s, 1800s, 1900s structure, let's recover that material and use it to repair other buildings in kind. And we ask, this doesn't help us recover those materials in kind, right? But this does. This is a picture from deconstruction contractor training that we held in San Antonio back in November of last year. And you can see kind of that new vision of how these buildings are coming down. And this is the outcome. I love this picture. This is something really magical happens when you see a building dismantled board by board and that entire structure laid out, organized on a site. You really learn like, wow, this building is a sum of its parts and pieces. I think sometimes we're so used to seeing a building as a whole, and it's really, really magical to see all of those boards come apart and know, at least in this case, that they're being redirected to repair other buildings of a similar construction era. But something that I often say is that we as a society have made it really, really easy to throw things away. Have you noticed that? It's so easy to throw things away, right? So we're innately challenged with kind of breaking down and challenging these systems that fill the landfill and feed the landfill. And what we really need to do to make it easier to reuse at all scales, especially a challenging material like construction and demolition waste, is partnerships. So this I call it a beehive because there's honeycombs, but this is not a beehive. Someone tell me what to call this. I'm still working on it 5 years later. But what's key here is that this is one of the first byproducts, a visual byproduct of a deconstruction advisory committee, which is the very first thing that we did in San Antonio when we as a city decided that we wanted to explore a policy initiative that resulted in more buildings being deconstructed and reused. And the reason we created this was to very clearly convey all of the kind of stakeholder groups that we were engaging with a policy like this. And what's really exciting about it is that circular construction, reusing materials, if you will, is a unifier between sometimes disparate industries, right? I know as a historic preservationist by trade and education that before we started exploring this, I didn't really know anyone in the solid waste department or the sustainability department or the housing department. And this topic touches all of them. And now they're on speed dial, whether they like it or not. But this is also really important for us to revisit in San Antonio and sharing it with other communities is that some of these on the screen here may be something that you care about in Nantucket, whether that be affordable housing, developing an innovative workforce that's localized, sustainability and resiliency, or cultural heritage. These are all unifying elements, not only in San Antonio, but across all of our industries and communities in the United States. And something that's really imperative to develop reuse policy is reuse is hyperlocal. So something that we had to explore in a very challenging, if you will, state climate in Texas is without the state political willpower to advance deconstruction and environmentalism broadly, we had to find that willpower locally. So for us, we've really kind of garnered this local ecosystem through galvanizing our stakeholders in all of these sectors that I showed you before. But these are things that I always encourage communities to think about is, what is your primary demolition driver? Do you have a local reuse ecosystem? Is it easy for you to find reclaimed materials? And if not, what would make it easier? And these are all hyper-local to you. And what we've developed in San Antonio, because what we love to do is share our wins, if you will, with other communities, especially because we're in Texas. I'm going to say that over and over again. Please do not tell the governor of Texas that we have a deconstruction ordinance because he'll be very mad at us. But these are elements that we think can be transferred to a bunch of different communities across the country, including your own. So on the screen here, you see these little squares, and I say that they're elements. These are elements that we've played with over the past 5 or 6 years to help grow a local reuse ecosystem. And that includes leveraging data, building up a reuse workforce, engaging with the community, thinking about how materials move within our cities, building up new networks and partnerships, and then of course, developing policies. But then we also have these strategies to do this playing, which includes physical actions like deconstruction workforce training, policy actions like an ordinance, or just encouraging someone to do something different. A planning action like developing a new committee, or community action, partnerships and events. So on the next series of slides, you're going to see these squares and these little icons on the side of the screen. You do not have to memorize what these mean, but I want to show you kind of how they ebb and flow with what we've explored and played with in San Antonio. And the first, here's a little visualization of that in action. But the very first element that I want to talk about is the most exciting data, right? Who's excited? Yeah, that's what I thought. So numbers are a foreign language to me. So when I think about data, I think of creative ways to communicate what is actually happening on the ground. And this is the most important data tool that we used in San Antonio was visualizing where demolitions were happening. So this is the same data set, just visualized differently. Now, San Antonio is the 7th largest city in the country, which means we are trending towards 600 demolitions a year. That includes all building types, commercial, residential, garages, things like that. But what's important about that trend up there is you can see that it's growing. It's not slowing down. We're also one of the fastest growing cities in the country. So it's important for us to show that trend. But on the left is where all of those demolitions are happening. Now, for those of you that may not be familiar with San Antonio, all of the heat map that's showing the highest concentration of yellow, those are our dense, older residential neighborhoods, our oldest housing stock. and those that are not protected. So the little polygons that you see are historic districts and neighborhood conservation districts. But just because they're not protected by an overlay that helps regulate what happens to these structures doesn't mean they're less valuable, right? It's the same building stock. It just may not have gotten that political willpower to be protected. So it's important for us to even look beyond what is capital P preservation or capital H historic and consider what happens to these buildings at the end of their lives if they do have to come down. So it was important for us to visualize that, because what I often say is that demolition, yes, it happens to buildings, but it also happens to people. It doesn't happen in a little bubble. It affects everything around it, right? And now these are the key issues in San Antonio that we honed in on before we decided that we wanted to bring a deconstruction ordinance forward. And these are all driven by data. So I have to give a shout out to Don Repkema in the audience, his consulting firm Place Economics. We went to him and said, hey, we don't know how much money we're throwing away in building materials into the landfill. Can you help us figure that out? And of course, him and his team said, yes. So these are some of the statistics that came from a report that we commissioned called Treasure in the Walls that looked at the economic value that we were throwing away via traditional demolition. And then started talking about how demolition is a form of air pollution, right? And how it's affecting our most vulnerable communities. And also discussing how there's an equity access disparity in access to these materials. So I almost referred to in San Antonio the way that materials were exchanged as a black market. We had contractors that knew what they were doing. They were taking materials out of buildings and giving them to other contractors, but there was this whole ecosystem underneath of homeowners, property stewards that didn't know how to access that black market. And that is a key thing that we wanted to interrogate a little bit with our policy is how can we make access to those materials more equitable and more available? Now, this is moving into a little bit of community engagement, but I love this quote. This quote is something that we've said over and over in the past few years, like an organ donor, a structure may have reached the end of its life, but its parts and pieces could help extend the lives of dozens of other structures. So that is what we see deconstruction and reuse as, is this way to maintain the life of other structures if we do it correctly. And I love showing newspaper archives because this also showcases that deconstruction is actually a historic trade, right? Demolition is new. Demolition came to the US after we created all of these war machines to fight World War II, and then they started tearing apart our cities bit by bit. But deconstruction is what we used to do. And this newspaper article basically says, this old post office building in San Antonio was deconstructed by 200 men in 1930, and the pillars were used to restore a building on the historic San Antonio Riverwalk. And you can still see that building with those old columns there today. And I also have to give a shout out to this pun, granite new life. Good, right? People were great back in the day with newspapers. So we like to showcase this to our community, and you can find dozens of examples like this, probably hundreds in Nantucket, of scavenging shipwrecks, of reusing old buildings from buildings that did come down over the course of the development of this incredible island, and kind of saying, why can't we do it again? Let's do it. And of course, training a workforce. The first time that the city of San Antonio held a deconstruction contractor training was back in 2019. That was only a few years after we started talking about what a policy might look like. So from the beginning, the city of San Antonio said, we want to build up this industry. And we started with registered contractors, certified demolition contractors, and said, hey, do y'all want a new skill set? And we offered this training at low cost and free in some cases. And all of these photos were taken at those deconstruction contractor trainings. And we partnered with the city's parks department, with other public authorities, the National Park Service even. We deconstructed one of their buildings. And one of my favorite anecdotes from one of these contractor trainings, especially at the National Park Service site, is the entire building was documented, right? We had taken pictures, we drew line drawings. Fun fact, in Texas, it's very rare to have basements. It really is a great party trick if you have one. But when we were dismantling this building as part of a deconstruction contractor training, we found a basement and no one had knew about it, right? Because it hadn't been documented before. It was constructed in the early 1900s. And as we scavenged with all of these new contractors in that basement, we found a bunch of moonshine bottles. And in triangulating with some of the research that had been done in that area long before, we knew that there was a very prominent like speakeasy in operation just down the street. And we were like, it's probably very likely that this was ground zero for that particular speakeasy. And none of that would have been uncovered if we had just leveled that structure into the ground and threw it all into a landfill. So the cultural heritage dimensions of deconstruction are so exciting to us, because deconstructing a building is almost like peeling away an onion. You're learning so much about how that structure developed over time, how its occupants lived and played in that building. And, maybe you'll uncover a dark moonshine story. Who knows? But it's great to afford that opportunity by using deconstruction as that kind of method. Here's another picture from a deconstruction contractor training that we held last November. And something that we love uncovering in our buildings are lumber stamps. So this is a stamp that someone wrote on a piece of lumber, almost akin to like putting your sign, if you're building a new building or renovating a building, like your own business sign on the front lawn. So of course this got covered up by drywall. This is shiplap. But we find this almost every time we dismantle a pre-1930 structure, and we tend to keep it. And now we're starting to document where these specific lumber companies were operating and building in San Antonio and creating a map with it. So this is another example of cultural heritage and revealing kind of the development of that neighborhood that maybe previously wasn't documented, because way back in the day, people weren't like, hey, I built this building, here's my lumber stamp, isn't that cool? No, that was just like what you did back in the day. But now uncovering it today and sharing it with our community, we shared this story on our Facebook page, and it garnered so many engagements from our community members who have found similar stamps in their own buildings when they've been renovating or deconstructing. So it really allows us to kind of capture that previously undocumented commercial business story of the development of San Antonio. Another one of my favorite things that I demand that all of our deconstruction contractors do for me selfishly is save some historic wallpaper. It's usually on cheesecloth in San Antonio. So I have this like collection of like, eventually I'd love to like showcase, this is the history of all of these designs that people use to decorate their houses before we covered it all up with drywall. And that wouldn't happen if we demolished it. But I have to give a good shout out to everyone here in the audience, especially some of you that I know are contractors, is that we have couched deconstruction as a traditional trade. Historic preservation is waste prevention, period. If you're restoring an existing structure, you are saving so much material from the landfill. You are stewarding our environment. So something that we have done in San Antonio for well over a decade is just train contractors on window repair, porch repair. Some of these pictures that you see on the bottom are from our large scale rehab events, where sometimes we rehab up to 20 homes in one day with the help of contractors and students and volunteers. And all of this is connected, right? So something that we're able to do now with a deconstruction policy is funnel some of the materials that are recovered into trades training, right? So we're able to recover old windows that maybe can't go into a building, but it can teach someone how to rebuild a window. So I always have to give a shout out to preservation, because we've been doing this for years. It's great. I'm about to share my favorite story with y'all. We're getting into community engagement too. Back a few years ago, we decided through our new partnerships with green buildings authorities, because we're talking about deconstruction, we decided to use a table for our office at an event called Solar Fest, which is basically like a big community fair, like public event where there's a bunch of vendors and community organizations. And we decided to use our booth not to talk about all of the fun regulatory work that our office does, but to talk about salvage and reuse. So we took a bunch of old building materials, old lumber, and chopped them into small little pieces and used them. This was right before Thanksgiving, to create holiday decor. So we have a lot of pictures of children decorating Christmas ornaments from old shingles, right? And then on the right, or on the left, is a turkey. Her name is Sally. She's made out of completely salvaged materials, including her beak is a door hinge, her eyeballs are little drawer pulls, and her little gobbler, maybe that's what you call it, is a drawer pull. And I have to give a shout out to my coworkers. They're amazing. They helped me build this in one of our coworkers' workshops. But the best part is that we somehow convinced the mayor of San Antonio to pardon Sally from the landfill in front of actual people. If y'all watched the show Parks and Recreation, this was our Parks and Recreation moment for sure. But with that came this proclamation, if you will. It was a faux proclamation. It wasn't real, but the mayor signed it afterwards, and we have it framed in our office. But it said a lot of really, really important things. It talked about how deconstruction was advancing our climate action plan. It talked about how reusing buildings was helping save our cultural heritage. And it was a great way to engage with the community in a creative way that wasn't about, you should do this or you should do that, but you can reuse reclaimed materials as art, and it can be fun, and it can be wacky and weird, but it can also be this unifying experience. So also, fun fact, right in the middle there is a picture of Spurs Jesus. The San Antonio Spurs have a super fan that dresses up as Jesus. I can't explain it, but we were very excited that he stopped by. Another way that we started engaging our community in a new way last year, just before our ordinance came to council vote, was this online campaign called Look at What I Reused. It was kind of like a little HGTV antidote to the demo day that you hear a lot about. But we wanted to crowdsource from residents in San Antonio to show us what they reused in whatever ways possible. So you see someone use completely reclaimed lumber to build what I have to say is one of the most beautiful bathroom vanities I've ever seen. Right in the middle there is this silhouette of New York City that our director created from salvage lumber. But what I love about this is that we had all of these new creative ways that we showed on our showcased on our social media to kind of dispel this myth that we heard a lot earlier in our efforts, which was we can't reclaim building materials because you won't be able to reuse them structurally. And in some cases that might be true, but even if you can't use it for what its original purpose was, that doesn't mean you can't reuse it in a fun and creative way. So if you ever visit our social media, you'll see some of these peppered throughout just to kind of challenge traditional norms about what might be trash and how we can turn it into treasure. So we have a whole database of this, and it was such a fun little experiment. All right. So I'm talking a lot about all of these things that we did. And I would say that with our toolkit that I referenced at the beginning with data and figuring out how to move materials and developing policies and engaging communities and cultivating networks, this is a culmination of all of that. So our office last year as well launched what we call the Material Innovation Center. And one of the first questions that we got from our stakeholders way back in 2018 was, if we're going to deconstruct, 20 to 50 more buildings a year, where is all that material going to go? And how are we going to move it, right? So we knew that the city had to play some role in either incubating or hosting a physical space for these materials to go temporarily. And I'm happy to say that we found that space in kind of an unlikely source, which is an old Air Force base owned by a development authority now called Port San Antonio. So if you don't know, San Antonio is Military City, USA. Anyone that gets trained for the Air Force gets trained in San Antonio. And we have an old Air Force base that is now decommissioned, Kelly Air Force Base. And these houses that you see on the screen here were built in the 1910s and 1920s to house the generals and their families that lived and worked at that Air Force base. Now it's on the National Register of Historic Places, but the new property owner for over 20 years has not known what to do with them. They were vacant for 20 years. And we went to them and said, hey, we know what to do with them. We can put building materials in them. And they said, that's weird, but okay. So that is what we're doing right now with these structures. And in addition to that, we're utilizing them as a trades laboratory and as a spot to do community education and education with college students. And I'll mention that in a moment. But what I love about these structures is that showcases the reality that almost every older building that you'll come across all over the United States has reused materials in it. Like for sure. At some point in the repair of that building, you're going to uncover some sort of evidence of reuse. And these are photos of the garage structure that's on the property that we're using to store materials. And you can just tell from looking at that picture with the lumber that it's a hodgepodge of whatever they could find to build this building in 1910. But on the right is a stamp in the ceiling that says Hagerstown, Maryland. So the ceiling, the shiplap that you see in the ceiling there was used to craft shipping crates, like wooden shipping crates that shipped airplane parts to Kelly Field in the 10s and the 20s. And that's evidence right in the ceiling. So they used shipping containers and then went and turned around and built these beautiful, durable, awesome houses that are still standing strong today. So we love to showcase that history and that evidence that's peeled away from the drop ceiling that you see there to showcase that this is a great, I would say, place to, experiment with what salvage can look like today in our existing economy. And I mentioned, in addition to a place for materials to come, we're also working on turning one of those bungalows into a tool library. So San Antonio doesn't have a tool lending library, but we see this as an integral component to making sure buildings can be stewarded and repaired. Tools can be a huge barrier to house repair in San Antonio and any other city. Tools are expensive. Sometimes you only need it for one project, like building a salvage turkey, if you will. So this is just another example of how we see this larger campus functioning as growing what I often call is a sharing economy. We're creating this new opportunity for people to exchange not only materials, but also tools in the stewardship of their buildings. And then I showed that picture of teaching people how to restore windows or houses. That's part of the Living Heritage Trades Academy that our office created a few years ago. And our Trades Academy, which adopts an apprentice model, someone learns from a contractor how to do work, and then they go off and they work a paid apprenticeship for 8 to 10 weeks with a master craftsman. They're using these houses as their learning lab, right? So they're actively restoring them, learning that trade. So all of that is happening on this one campus. And this is a huge vision for that campus. I know this is really small, but we have a lot of really amazing architecture partners that have really bought into this vision. And what's really important here is that every different color that you see on this campus, there are over 25 houses on this campus, serves a different function. So of course we have this material innovation space where materials are donated and then we're exploring how to reuse them. But you also have design offices, the tool library, artist studios, restaurants. So we're actively looking at figuring out how this campus can turn into what I call a multi-material circular economy campus, which means, yes, we're talking about how to reuse building materials, but that doesn't mean we can't later expand to how can we reuse textiles or electronics or other materials that are difficult to reuse, and use this as kind of this fun testing ground to build up an economy around it. And here's this organ donor analogy. So what I love about the Material Innovation Center is that it's serving as this space for people to donate excess or reuse building materials that they no longer need. And that doesn't have to just come from deconstruction projects, it can come from renovation projects. So you see on the left there is inside that garage structure that I showed you that had all of that weird lumber in it. Those are from a deconstruction contractor training, but we've also have large building owners that have, have high turnover spaces like retail, which is renovated a lot. They're just starting to donate the materials to our center because they don't want to throw it away and they know it will be reused. And one of the ways that we're reusing them actively right now in San Antonio is for events like Rehaborama. That's that event where I mentioned that we rehab 20 houses in one day with the help of contractors and students and volunteers. So instead of going to Home Depot or a big box store to buy brand new lumber, we're reusing lumber from the same construction era that is donated to our center. So you can kind of see that circular mindset in action that is facilitated by that physical space. And how many of y'all are familiar with Sears Kits houses? Yes, okay, so you used to be able to buy houses in catalogs, what a dream. But these are also some smaller structures on that Material Innovation Center campus site, these little carriage houses. They're some of my favorites, they're so cute. And what we're looking to them as is kind of the revival of this kit house concept, right? So they're the perfect size for a small scale accessory dwelling unit to be built in someone's backyard. Affordable housing is the biggest priority for our mayor right now, and infilling into established districts is a huge opportunity. So we say, why can't we look to those existing small scale structures to inform those designs? And we call this a concept salvage to ADU, salvage to accessory dwelling unit. So these images that you see on the screen here were also taken at that center. And the structures that you can see built underneath these garages are an advanced architecture studio at UT San Antonio. Their entire studio project was salvaged to ADU. So they used materials that were donated to our center to build structural systems out of reclaimed materials. So that's what you see there is those mock-ups, full-scale mock-ups in action. So they're actually thinking about, and I love this because I didn't learn any of this in design school, right? Is they're thinking about how to reuse that reclaimed material to build something new. And this again goes to sometimes when you're recovering or renovating or deconstructing, you're going to find materials that maybe aren't ideal to reuse, like really short pieces of lumber that's splintered. And this is where the innovation part comes in, right? We're now engaging our computer science departments, our materials science departments as well, you know, the smart engineers that figure out how to make materials. I don't know how to do that, but they're really smart. And they're bringing all of that manpower together to solve this problem. Why can't we use that less ideal material that's coming out of housing to build something new? So that's the incubation, the innovation things that are happening on this campus. And it's all because we started talking about deconstruction. This was happening well before we regulated how buildings come down. It's just planting that seed of, let's approach this a little bit differently and see what comes from it. And students are the best ways to do that. Now, going back to everyone's favorite thing, data, this is really exciting because this is all information that we have never collected before as a city. So when we have deconstruction projects come through our pipeline, we're learning about how much material is diverted from the landfill for reuse. We're learning about the workforce impact, how many people are used to take down that buildings. And then the most exciting is that we've had some buildings that came to our office as demolition projects. We flagged it as needing to come down via deconstruction. And our deconstruction contractors, some of them are general contractors that specialize in preservation and restoration. They've walked into these buildings and say, hey, this has really good bones. Have you thought about restoring it? And in some cases, the owner of that building has never considered it because they've been surrounded by people that have said, this building is terrible, you need to tear it down. We've had some buildings that have converted from demolitions to restorations because of this ordinance. It's this new push point, that opportunity to reflect on how we want to steward that building that just wasn't there before. So now we're tracking that fun piece of data, which we never expected. And these are some of the things that we're collecting through the Material Innovation Center. We're tracking workforce, we're tracking housing, and something new that we're starting to grow into is disaster response. How can we use this material bank of reclaimed materials to repair structures quickly if there's a disaster? Now in San Antonio, we're way too far from the coast. It makes me so sad. I'm so glad I'm around water right now to be affected dramatically by hurricanes, but we do have a lot of flash flooding. We have a large hail that can damage certain parts of buildings. So now we're reflecting on how we might be able to train contractors to rapidly deploy reclaimed materials to fix older houses quickly. So this is all of the fun data that we're exploring and playing with in San Antonio now. And then we're also growing our partnerships with architects and designers. These things on the screen are exactly from a presentation that I gave to them in San Antonio a few weeks ago. We are encouraging contractors to donate materials to our center because we now have that physical space. And something that's exciting in San Antonio, transportation is really hard. Building materials are huge. They're also really heavy and cumbersome. There's a new startup in San Antonio that launched partially in response to that conversation. Specifically, I call it like an Uber for moving materials. So there are these drivers that are on call to pick up materials from a space and bring it to our center or bring it to a new project site. We just did our first pilot last week from a large general contractor project. They took out all of these older windows. They were going to throw them in the landfill. They said, hey, that crazy Office of Historic Preservation likes to save things. I wonder if they want this. And we said, of course we do. I have a problem saying no, I'm working on it. But this contractor, this startup was able to pick up those materials, take them to our center, and I didn't move an inch. So we're exploring all of these creative ways to figure out how to build up that reuse ecosystem in ways that we haven't seen operating before. And something that's really exciting that came from one of my favorite architects in San Antonio is she came up to me a few weeks ago and said, we should create a new training program for architects that focuses on reuse. And we should embed preservation topics. We don't learn how to restore brick. We don't learn how to restore mortar or limestone or restore older siding. We want to learn about that. And we also want to learn how we can reuse more buildings on site and reuse more materials on site. And I said, okay, let's do it. So that's something that we're working on now too, is how we might be able to establish a new training program with all of our architects in San Antonio and potentially scale that up to other cities and beyond. So reflecting back on kind of this toolkit that we're operating within, these are all of the things that we've played with over the past 5 years. We've talked about workforce, we've built up this workforce, we've engaged, we've built salvage turkeys, we've developed these networks and partnerships, we've looked at data in ways we've never looked at it before. And it's created this whole new way of thinking about our built environment. We still have so much more to do and so far to go, but it has created this, what I call reuse ecosystem that is excited and thinking about the waste that our buildings generate in a brand new way. And I'm so excited about it. So this is reuse is community resilience. I would say these are the 3 pillars of our entire program, and you will not see the word preservation mentioned at all, but that doesn't mean that preservation isn't influencing every single one of these. So we see all of the things that I've shared with you today, policies, partnerships, programs, the Material Innovation Center, as fostering a community through exchange. We want to create this culture of abundance and knowledge sharing and tool sharing and material sharing with our neighbors so they have access to that information and access to those resources they may have had difficulty accessing before, like contractors to deconstruct or materials to repair their building. We want to build that up. We also are focusing on equity of access and affordability of resources, again, making sure people have access to them if they want them and need them. And then just building a more resilient and circular future. We want to kind of challenge this take, make, waste system, this single-use system of reusing something for one purpose and then throwing it away. We want to challenge that and see how we might be able to bring economic opportunity, innovation, creativity from those things that are moving through our built environment. And this is something that I will say until the end of time. The landfill doesn't deserve these materials. Our communities do. Again, the audacity of the landfill to think that it deserves these materials, that is crazy. They're beautiful. We can recover them and use them in so many new and creative ways. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much to Stephanie for all